Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another very exciting Civilizations in Review. My name is Ben. I'm here with Alfuzaic and two phenomenal content writers as we're going to talk about another fabulous ancient empire. Today is Mesopotamia Day, so get excited to dive deep into that part of history. Before we start, I just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. We will also be cross-posting this to our Instagram, our website, our YouTube, and our Spotify, so you can engage and listen and learn everywhere. And of course, on our website itself, there's so much incredible content here that we will not get to tonight in this short little call. So read, explore, and whatnot. I'm very excited to introduce Shannon, one of our fellows and the writer of the Mari Empire to talk all about them today. And Coretta, one of our initial content writers, the very first Civilizations in Review talkback, to help co-interview. So welcome you both. Very excited to learn all about this ancient kingdom. And Coretta, take it away with the introduction.
Will do. I was just saying this earlier to Shannon and Ben, but this is a kingdom that I know nothing about and genuinely did not read about before we did this conversation today, which means I am fully excited to learn everything and hear all about your expertise, Shannon, and all of the unexplored things that you still have to learn about the Mari Empire or kingdom. Correct myself there. So I'll go ahead and start by reading your overview. That's also on the Alfuzaic website for anyone who wants to read along. In what is now modern day Syria, Mari, or Tel Hariri, was a city-state that spread from the western bank of the Euphrates River beyond Deir ez-Zor. The Mariots, is it pronounced like that, Mariots?
That's how I pronounce it.
So the Marius existed as a multicultural place of trade and metallurgy, with Amorites and Akkadians exacting substantial influence over the people and the culture of this region. It existed as a city-state from 2900 BCE until 1760 BCE, and existed throughout antiquity until it vanished from the historical records. Despite the discovery of over 15,000 cuneiform tablets related to the Mari, it remains relatively unknown in the larger discussions of civilizations in the Middle East and North Africa. That's a great summary.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for kickstarting us off, Coretta. Tell us everything, Shannon, but we'll begin with an actual question, which is what drew you to this kingdom in all of the list for you to write your Civilizations 101?
Sure. So a few years ago, I was in Berlin going to a bunch of different museums, and I was actually in the Islamic art section of one of the museums there. And it had a piece about the Mari Royal Palace in particular, and the huge excavation that had happened in the 1930s to uncover these like thousands of tablets and this pretty well preserved palace. And it always just stuck with me because it's just not something you hear about. Like the idea of like over 15,000 tablets being like perfectly preserved, essentially, that archaeologists can like read and translate was like an amazing thing to me. And I had never previously heard or even seen anything about the civilization before. And so it just always stuck with me, and I decided this was a great opportunity to sort of learn more and engage more with the culture and the kingdom.
In your research, did you come across maybe one of the reasons why, despite all of these tablets, it is relatively unknown in the studies of this region?
I think basically what I was able to formulate was that it just doesn't have as good of PR as say like the Sumerians or the Akkadians, which are much more well known civilizations. For whatever reason, despite these like amazing archaeological finds that have happened for the civilization, it didn't get the press that other ones did. And I also think in part because it had such these sort of huge neighbors in that regard, right? That it was hard to compete in that way. In a lot of the literature, it is referred to as the middleman of civilizations, and I think as a result, it kind of just got swept over compared to the other better public campaigns, maybe we'll say, of the other civilizations.
Good to know PR is just as important in 2000 BCE as it is today.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I mean, what I find really fascinating about Mari, and it's especially in relation to the other kingdoms, empires, caliphates on Al-Fuzaic's full list, is the emphasis on trade. I mean, that's one of the very first things you talk about in your introduction, and I see it sprinkled throughout. I mean, that's really how these communities thrived, was the exchange of goods, and especially Mari's location. I mean, it's like far eastern Syria, right on the Euphrates. So I can
Correct.
Waterways, the pathways, the special trade routes. I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing because this is also relatively new to me as well. But my question is is that a big part of Mari's flourishing existence? Is their location and trade prowess, I guess I could say.
Yeah, for sure. So much so that they created artificial waterways to connect their empires to the Euphrates, which would be a feat in 2022, let alone in 2900 BCE to be making such huge infrastructure investments. But it also speaks to how big of a influence it was in their civilization, right? You don't invest that type of time and energy and people power into something that isn't going to pay off for you ultimately. And that's how the Mari stayed relevant, was by controlling these waterways and controlling parts of the Euphrates, so much so that they would toll you. Again, everything that is old is new again. You try to get over anything in New York City, where I'm from, you too will have to pay a toll. And so, they continue that, and that's how they fund their empires, how they keep their rivals as kind of allies simultaneously, is by reminding them that they have to go through the Mari territory ultimately in order to get where they want to go, which I think is it's a very strategic, if not something that will come back to bite you, political system.
That's really smart. I mean, you mentioned earlier that they kind of played this middleman role, and what better way to do that to have control over the trade and the means of connection, not just having control over a particularly sought after product, but actually the means of moving that product and being that lifeline. Maybe it's not as flashy of something to be known for, but it's definitely very effective. What was the
it's pragmatic, right? So, and I think that word probably describes the Mari kingdoms the best, is they were pragmatists. In all of the decisions they seem to have made was about, how do I create an empire or a kingdom that serves the people well, but also continues to flow in money and trade and influence simultaneously.
Well, speaking of the people who are in the Mari Empire or the Mari Kingdom, where was it a very diverse group of people? I'm especially wondering, with all of that trade and the movement through the waterways, if it was a more stable community or if there was a lot of change.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So when I was researching, it was very difficult to come up with a quote unquote culture, if you want to put it that way, that reflected anything, of the proletariat, let's say, right? It was the cuneiform tablets that I mentioned earlier. They only speak to the royal life. They don't speak to everyday life, which is true of really any civilization in which you uncover writings as a rule. So it was difficult, but from what I was able to surmise, essentially it was a conglomeration. It was a melting pot of all the neighboring civilizations, and because of which makes sense if you think about it, if it's as its role as a trading post and in the commerce, that it would be a diverse group of merchants and such that would live in this area. But there wasn't really any standout characteristics that at least I was able to observe about the people that make up the Mari kingdoms, that would differentiate them. And they're even referred to as Sumerians and such throughout the writings. So there wasn't really a distinct identity in that regard.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. There's not really a parallel in that aspect of Mari's culture or civilization.
Mm,
And these are all called civilizations, but like in the way that the people
yeah.
live, there's not really a overlap. Like the trading aspect or middleman or the tax or toll,
Hmm.
you can see that in most of these empires.
Sure.
That is a really fascinating like cohabitation model. That's the word I'm looking for.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Really cool. Wow, interesting. I'm going to sit with that for a little bit, but ask you a new question. That's really
Sure.
and sort of in that same space, but I want to sort of dive into your ruling system. You have the Shakanaku, I think is the right word, or like governor oligarchy.
Sounds good to me. Hmm.
Sure, that's not Arabic, so I did my best. But tell us more about that system. It seems similar to a lot of the Mesopotamian like ruling system of this city state, part of this larger trading prowess, but having their own, oligarchy, for lack of a better term. But I wasn't sure if, through your research, you discovered anything more in the ruling system specifically of the Mari.
Yeah. So again, the Mari are interesting in that they sort of had three iterations. You think they're gone, then they come back. Then you think they're gone, then they come back. And each iteration has its own variation. I mean, they're all sort of variations on a theme, like a strict monarchy versus an oligarchy with governors, like what you're referring to, which I believe is in the Second Kingdom. Um, it to your point speaks to sort of the systems at the time. It wasn't unique in that regard. There would have been a similar structures in other civilizations in the area and throughout the world. But what I found interesting about it was that these governors, as they're referred to, for lack of, because I'm not going to try and say the word, I'm not going to try and do it, um, had an immense amount of control, but still referred back to the oligarchy. There isn't anything in the history that I was able to learn about that sort of showed any like major contentions. And when you think about this throughout history, the idea of like the implementers versus the rulers, there's often a clashing that happens eventually within those things because the implementers want to be the rulers and the rulers are like, please no. So, I found it interesting that instead of any rioting or any coups or any other variation that could have occurred, it didn't really happen. They sort of just peacefully fell away as a system, and then a new system came back in its place. Um, so I found that to be, there wasn't any kind of information about upheaval within the systems. They kind of just went away when they weren't useful, and new ones replaced them. And so and the new ones that replaced them in like the Third Kingdom still had these versions of governors and scribes, but they played like a less influential role. The governors were not as well respected, and they were not as influential later on. But that was also the empire and kingdoms were losing their influence as time was going on. So that also makes sense in that. But yeah, I've never really seen sort of like a comes up, new thing goes away peacefully, new thing comes up again. It's sort of unheard of in my understanding of history and civilization. So
That is really interesting that they have these three iterations, especially going from monarchy to an oligarchy, and then back to this monarchical system. That's really fascinating. I wonder, if there were, like you were saying earlier, these cuneiform tablets are from the elite and the elite
yeah,
perspective on history and how these transitions maybe happened. Um,
right.
and it would take probably a huge library and an immense amount of digging to put together maybe stories from the surrounding civilizations and how they saw the power shifts within the Mari kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I'm very, very curious with, I'm going to jump a little bit to your talk about allies and rivals. It
Sure.
wasn't exactly a peaceful period in relationship to other interested parties, maybe in those waterways and that really rich place for trade. Can you talk a little bit more about how the Mari related to all the other groups around them?
Yeah, so everyone was always trying to conquer the land that the Mari had because it was valuable. It's valuable land. It's, if you can control waterways, you can control, especially during this time, most things. Um, I mean, still true. You know, you look at what happened with the Suez Canal, you know, a few months ago. If you block a waterway, even today, it's not great. Um, so, you know, as a result, though, the Mari didn't have a lot of allies. Nobody really wanted to work with them, um, because they just wanted to take over them. And that's Babylon. The Babylonians are a good example. They're constantly trying to pick a fight with the Mari kingdoms, and will eventually win. Um, the Sumerians get in on it. The Eblians get in on it as well, um, because everyone wants the land. Everyone wants to be able to control the waterways, to get the taxes or toll money the Mari have been instituting, and to control the trade, basically, for the entire area. But because they don't necessarily succeed super often, they have to end up working together. I wouldn't describe them as allies, though. They're sort of just like, you know, just like a transactional relationship, rather than a "I will come to your aid if something happens" relationship. The only real example I could find, and I'm going to really butcher the name, is the Shuna. Yeah, and they were a relatively small empire themselves, kingdom themselves, and were like quickly overtaken by the Babylonians themselves. And so that didn't really last very long in terms of an allyship for the Mari, but they tried. And that's really what counts.
It is what counts. I love that. That's adorable. I am so fascinated. You just sort of dropped it as a super cool construction piece, but these like not irrigation necessarily, but new waterways, pathways, connections to the Euphrates.
Sure.
Do you have more info on that? Because that is so fascinatingly interesting. I know that's a double synonym, but I'm just so curious by this. If you could share more, that would be great.
Yeah, it's one of the other main pieces that I like. I have a background in urban design, and so in order to understand, like, the Mari are a planned civilization. Like, it didn't just sprout up because like the Euphrates is a fertile ground, and therefore you should have, you know, people were like, "Ooh, let me settle here," and "Ooh, let me build a structure here," and then it just kept building. No, they were like, "Oh, this is useful. We're going to intentionally build an entire city that gets to exist here." Um, and that is, I don't know how you do that in 2900 BCE. That's, you know, out of my realm of understanding, really. And so included in that is everything from like dual wall structures, so to protect, for one, against flooding from the Euphrates, because, you know, like a dam and lock system hasn't been created or anything like that at this time. So they have one wall to stop that. They have another wall to stop enemies. Um, they have dams in order within the systems, basically, to allow the water to flow through, and prevent the city from flooding. And they created all these artificial waterways in order to move products, because they did create their own, metallurgy was their big source of creation, and therefore trade for themselves. And they use these waterways to transport those items to the Euphrates to then transport out to the rest of the world. And so, you know, they had paved roads, and these are all like, yeah, it's like a fascinating thing to learn. So it's a very interesting study on urban design. And each of the kingdom, like from the second kingdom and the third kingdom, is really where a lot of the roads being mapped out and drainage happening, were really put in place and allowed the civilization to expand as it did, and probably kept them from getting overwhelmed in terms of biological disasters as a result. If you think about what like flooded waters could do to a place with no drainage or anything, you get septic issues, so on and so forth, which can allow you and your civilization, uh, you know, which would prevent you and your civilization from being able to prosper, give a weak point for your rivals, which Mari did not need. So yeah, it's a really cool. I don't know of any other place that it's quite so well designed.
Yeah, it's fascinating. They must have had some really great city planners, good
Yeah,
urban planners, um, especially to harness such a powerful resource, but that can at the
yeah,
same time be incredibly unpredictable and devastating,
for
like
sure.
water. That's really interesting. Is that something that, or I guess, in what ways has the Mari's legacy affected the modern world today? Is there any influence that carries through?
See, that's hard because I think that comes back to like this idea that it just didn't get the PR campaign it deserved throughout its time. Um, and so I don't know that you would know that it had an influence, right? I think its biggest influence, honestly, is in its preservation. Um, because 15,000 tablets, even if it is just on royal life, still tells you a lot about what Mesopotamia would have looked like during the Bronze Age.
Mm,
Um, in a way that not having those tablets would not, right? And those tablets cover everything from like legislative items to like orders of the royal palace, to interactions between royals. And so it does give like there's a wide breadth, I think, of understanding that comes from that. Of course, of a very limited scope of people at that time, um, but it's useful, and we have to assume at least could be a good model for what other city states in that area would have looked like at the time, or how they might have functioned, or what you mentioned earlier, what some of those rivalries slash trades would have looked like, because they were all together, even if it wasn't like a very peaceful time. The royals were probably documenting that in some way, as those transitions are happening as well.
mhm, mm. That's
And
fascinating.
then, yeah, and the preservation of the palace is the other one, right? From an architectural standpoint, the fact that that palace, well, we don't really know, right? Because unfortunately, with the civil war in Syria, it has had it has been observed that the Mari Palace was probably one of the first things to have been destroyed. Um, and so what it exists as now is sort of to be determined. But while it would have been a great example, um, of what the architecture of that time would have looked like. So, and what those influences would have been as well from a cultural and artistic standpoint.
Yeah. The main image of Mari is like a fresco, I guess, for lack of a more effective term, of that ancient palace.
Yeah,
Um, I think it's actually from the Berlin Museum, so maybe you've seen it in person already when you were there.
yeah, yeah. I
Um,
probably have.
Hey, that's where it all began. We love it.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things I've said on most civilizations in review, but not nearly as eloquently as you have, is the importance of showcasing these different empires and the impacts they've made, their periods of history, and what they did. As you have said, a PR campaign is all of that in 2 words. So I do appreciate this much faster way of describing a really showcasing, no, these were really important periods of history, and maybe we don't know Mari's influence, but there's undeniable ones, and in all the empires after, clearly built off of the ingenuity of the Mari engineers, city planners, trading, what have you.
For
And so
sure.
either Mesopotamian, maybe even North African as they have connected, or Eastern
Yeah.
Asian, or whatever empires have been built off. I mean, maybe I'm giving Mari way too much credit, but we don't know. So they're gonna get it
Yeah,
all.
exactly.
Regardless, that's one of the biggest reasons why there are so many civilizations in our civilization section of Alfuzaic, is to, in essence, be this PR space of look at this really cool
Mhm.
piece of history, learn from them, read these hyperlinks, get excited, dive deep into this ancient archaeological discovery mode. So
For sure.
definitely have maybe one or two more questions for you, Shannon, but thank you for being the
Absolutely.
expert as you now are. Really fascinating to dive really in depth with them. I guess we're toward the year of our time, towards the end of our time here. So there's any sort of final things you'd like to share, a cool piece of trivia on top of the many cool ones you've already learned that you'd like to share? I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I think one, I'm very happy to be the spokesperson for the Mari at the moment so that they get their proper PR campaign finally. Um, And the other one is I really think the palace is such an interesting um it's such an interesting point because it is the thing that eventually got people to be interested. The palace was discovered in the 1930s by French archaeologists, and it was the thing that drove other archaeologists, other historians to want to learn more about the Mari. And part of that was finally discovering those cuneiform tablets that I've been mentioning. And I think that we underestimate how important like the art or the structures of a civilization are into getting people to be engaged with it, right? So I think that like the example of the Mari Palace, and fortunately it does exist in pictures, in replicas that you can see and learn about, regardless of its current form, um, is a way should be used and should be expanded upon to get people interested in like sort of these more unknown cultures. Because I mentioned earlier that I couldn't find anything distinct about the Mari culture. But in order to do frescoes, in order to create architecture, you have to have a distinct culture. And then it manifests itself in these rooms and in the art and in the language that's used. And so I think that if it got more attention, if it was brought more to the forefront, it would encourage people to invest more time and energy into translating, into finding, into developing and writing about it. And so I think that that would be my campaign pitch for it. That would be my stump speech, in order to get it, because who knows like what other cool things there are. Like I'm still fascinated that they had drainage systems. Like there are some places in the US that do not have proper drainage systems. So there's still a lot to be learned, and to see how it has influenced cultures throughout and how it could maybe be a replica and a map to be used today. Um, that would be my parting words for the Mari 101.
That's a great stump speech.
Thank you.
I honestly am coming from the beginning of this, knowing absolutely nothing. I'm so grateful that you took the time to write about this, and I'm grateful to have been invited to co-host today. So thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
For calling me in on this.
Yeah, appreciate all your questions. Hopefully now you want to learn more about the Mari, and that's great.
I do. I very much do.
Well, so Shannon, not only are you an expert on Mari, but you're a PR stump speech extraordinaire. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in for this really fascinating dive to 4,600 years ago, with an accurate and lively irrigation, drainage, and wall defense system that rivals modern countries today. It's crazy. Please read the website. There are many more pieces we did not even touch tonight in this call. So many more fascinating aspects of Mari and all of their hyperlinks as well. So please make sure to head to the alphusaic.net portion of our site to explore with the Mari. Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you, Shannon, for your wonderful, fabulous research and knowledge. Coretta for your insights and engaging questions. And to our listeners for learning all about this fabulous slice of history. Have a wonderful evening all. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.